Marco Rubio's 3-minute debate with Macron that shook the world. Macron finished his speech with a smile. He didn't think Marco Rubio would dare challenge him. In the NATO meeting hall in Brussels, 30 world leaders had just applauded the French president's announcement of the European Defence Union plan. Macron was celebrating his victory. This plan, which would limit America's role in NATO, was the first step toward the European hegemony he had dreamed of. But he didn't know what was inside the folder that Marco Rubio, sitting quietly across the table, held in his hand. When the US Secretary of State slowly stood up, the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. The determination in his eyes caused everyone to hold their breath, because the words Rubio was about to say would shake not only Macron but the future of all of Europe, redefining 70-year-old alliances. But only 80 seconds later, the smile on the French president's face would turn to shock, and when that secret file on the table was opened. The meeting hall on the 12th floor of NATO headquarters was where Europe's most critical diplomatic decisions were made. On that cold March morning, the hall had a more tense atmosphere than usual. The leaders sitting around the table were aware that they would be writing history for future generations. Emmanuel Macron had come to this meeting with special preparation as the President of France. The documents in his hand contained plans that would reshape Europe's defense future. This project, titled European Strategic Autonomy, envisioned minimizing America's role in European defense and instead establishing a European army under French leadership. "Dear colleagues," Macron began, with a confident voice, "the decision we make here today will be a milestone in Europe's independence. We have lived under America's security umbrella for 75 years. Now it's time to stand on our own feet." German Chancellor Laura Weber nodded her head. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Romano applauded. The absence of the British after Brexit had made Macron's plans even stronger. "The European Defence Union proposed by France," Macron continued, "is not just a military alliance, but also a technological, economic and diplomatic union of power. We will end our dependence on American weapons technology and strengthen our own defense industry." Marco Rubio listened quietly. As US Secretary of State, he had come to this meeting with a very special mission. The leather-bound folder in his hand contained critical intelligence information that the CIA had gathered over the past 6 months. Macron's real intentions were much more complex than what he was announcing. "We will free our energy security from dependence on Russian gas," said Macron, raising his voice. "Instead, we will work with our new allies in the Middle East, especially the agreements we will make with Algeria and Morocco." It was at this exact point that Rubio's eyebrows furrowed. The information in his folder showed what kind of secret agreements Macron had made with these new allies. Europe's own currency, the euro, will now balance the dollar in international trade. Macron continued, "We will establish payment networks alternative to the SWIFT system. We will end America's financial hegemony." The leaders in the hall were mesmerized. Macron's vision was impressive. An independent Europe was an attractive goal. But Rubio knew the real motivations behind this plan. "And most importantly," said Macron, dramatically lowering his voice, "we will gradually close America's military bases on European soil, Ramstein Incirlik, bases in Spain. We no longer need them." Upon these words, the hall echoed with applause. Norwegian Prime Minister Erik Hansen stood up. "Emmanuel, this vision is truly inspiring. Europe will finally take control of its own destiny." Macron smiled. He was pleased that his plan was accepted so easily. He scanned the hall with his eyes and turned to Marco Rubio. "Of course, we also expect the understanding of our dear American friends in this process. After all, this is not hostility, but maturation." It was at this exact moment that Marco Rubio stood up. The atmosphere in the hall suddenly changed. Everyone held their breath. The expression on Rubio's face indicated that a very serious speech was coming. "President Macron," said Rubio, with cold determination in his voice, "I thank you and all my colleagues in this hall. We have indeed listened to a very inspiring speech." Macron seemed relieved. Rubio's beginning sounded positive. However, Rubio continued, placing his folder on the table. "Before making such important decisions, I need to share some truths, because everyone in this hall should know what exactly lies behind the decisions we make." Macron's smile faded slightly. Rubio's folder was beginning to make him uncomfortable. "What Mr. Macron mentioned about new allies is very interesting," said Rubio, taking out the first document from his folder. "Especially the secret agreement you made with Algeria last month. In this agreement, Algeria will sell natural gas in euros, and in return, France will support Algeria's territorial claims against Morocco." The atmosphere in the hall suddenly became tense. Moroccan ambassador Ahmed bin Youssef straightened up at his table. This information had not yet been disclosed. "But what's really interesting," Rubio continued, "is the secret clause of this agreement. Algeria, in exchange for its interests in the Mediterranean, is giving France a 20-year military base agreement. So, Mr. Macron, while talking about closing America's bases on one hand, you're establishing your own bases in North Africa on the other." Macron's face reddened. "This is a completely wrong interpretation. Our agreements with Algeria are purely commercial." Dr. Rubio, German Chancellor Weber interjected, "Do you have documents supporting these claims?" Rubio took out the second document. "Here is the original agreement signed by Algeria's Defense Minister General Mahoud el-Rashid. And here is the English translation." The document circulated around the hall. The expression on every leader's face who read it changed. "But this is just the beginning," said Rubio, the coldness in his voice increasing. "The system Mr. Macron calls alternative to SWIFT is actually a secret network he established with Iranian and Chinese banks. Through this network, European companies are planned to sell weapons to Iran." "This is absurd," shouted Macron, jumping to his feet. "This is completely slander." "Slander?" said Rubio, taking out the third document. "Here is the preliminary agreement signed by French defense company Thomson Aerospace with Iran. Sale of missile guidance systems and radar technology. The signature belongs to your defense minister Jean-Claude Moreau." The hall was now completely silent. Italian Prime Minister Romano looked at Macron with astonishment. "And of course the biggest surprise," said Rubio, taking out the fourth document, "your secret energy agreement with Russia. On one hand, you pretend to impose sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, you secretly sign a 10-year natural gas agreement with Putin. The price is also 30% below market price." Macron's face was now completely white. This, from where?" "From CIA operations in Paris," said Rubio with a cold smile. "We've been tracking your every move for the past 8 months, Mr. Macron. Every secret meeting, every phone call." Norwegian Prime Minister Hansen asked in astonishment, "So if this information is true, what is Emmanuel's real purpose?" Rubio took out the last document. "Here is the real plan. The project called Operation Napoleon. France's plan to fill the power vacuum that will emerge with America's withdrawal from Europe, establishing strategic alliances with both Russia and China. The goal is to create a tripartite bloc to break America's global hegemony." "This is complete nonsense," shouted Macron. "You America, you're afraid of Europe's independence." "Independence?" said Rubio, raising his voice. "Being dependent on Russian gas with a 30% discount is independence. Supporting terrorism by selling weapons to Iran is independence. Using a payment system controlled by Chinese banks is independence." The hall was beginning to get chaotic. Some leaders were whispering at their tables, while others looked at Macron in shock. "Manuel," said German Chancellor Weber, her voice trembling, "if these documents are real, you lied to us. While talking about European unity, you're actually establishing French hegemony for your own interests." "Laura, please," said Macron, desperately. "This is American propaganda. They divide and conquer us." "Propaganda," said Rubio, showing the last document he took from his folder. "Here is the letter you wrote to Putin in your own handwriting. It starts with Mon cher Vladimir and it contains this: after America withdraws from Europe, the strategic partnership between France and Russia will change the world balance." The letter circulated around the hall. Everyone who recognized Macron's handwriting understood that the document was real. Italian Prime Minister Romano stood up. "Emmanuel, if this is true, you put not only France but all of Europe in danger. The worst part of this," added Rubio, "is that Mr. Macron's plan also includes France's support for Russia's operations in Ukraine if America opposes it. Because the goal is to completely collapse NATO and replace it with a France-Russia-China axis." "Enough," shouted Macron, slamming his fist on the table. "I cannot tolerate such slander. You Americans cannot accept Europe getting stronger." "Slander," said Rubio in a calm voice. "Then these voice recordings must also be slander." Rubio took out his phone and pressed a button. Macron's voice echoed in the hall. "Vladimir, our plan is progressing perfectly. The Germans didn't suspect anything. In 2 months we will start the process of closing America's European bases." As the voice recording continued, Macron's face turned ashen. Everyone in the hall was looking at each other in astonishment. "How were these voice recordings obtained?" asked Dutch Prime Minister Jan Vermeer. "During NSA's routine surveillance," said Rubio. "Mr. Macron thought he was using a secure line, but—" Macron suddenly got up from the table. "This meeting is over. France does not accept these accusations." "Sit down, Emmanuel," said Weber in a stern voice. "We haven't finished yet. If these documents are real, even France's EU membership is debatable." "Are you threatening the EU, Laura?" Macron lashed out. "Not a threat. Reality," interjected Italian Prime Minister Romano. "You talk about forming an alliance with us, while secretly making deals with our enemies behind our backs." But what nobody in that room knew was that this confrontation was just the tip of the iceberg. Marco Rubio had much more devastating information in his possession, information that would not only end Macron's political career, but reshape the entire geopolitical landscape of Europe. The tension in the room was palpable as Rubio reached into his briefcase once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of shocked conversations, "what I've shown you so far represents only the operational level of Mr. Macron's deception. The strategic implications go much deeper." He pulled out a thick manila folder marked with red classification stamps. "This is Operation Charlemagne, France's master plan to recreate the Carolingian Empire under modern geopolitical conditions." Macron's face went from white to green. That codename was known only to his innermost circle. "According to these documents," Rubio continued, opening the folder methodically, "France has been systematically undermining EU institutions for the past 3 years, not to strengthen Europe, but to weaken it enough that French leadership becomes the only viable option." German Chancellor Weber leaned forward. "What do you mean by undermining?" "I mean deliberately sabotaging EU defense initiatives that France couldn't control," Rubio replied, pulling out a series of photographs. "These are images from a secret meeting in Lyon 6 months ago. Mr. Macron met with representatives from Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary organization. The photographs showed Macron shaking hands with a man identified in the caption as Dmitry Volkov, a known Wagner operative. The purpose of this meeting, Rubio explained, was to coordinate Wagner's activities in Africa with French military operations. The goal: create instability that would justify increased French intervention and make other EU nations dependent on French security guarantees. "This is fabrication," Macron shouted, but his voice cracked. "These photos could be doctored." "Could be," Rubio agreed calmly, "but the financial transfers are harder to fake." He pulled out bank statements. These show 50 million transferred from French intelligence accounts to shell companies controlled by Wagner Group. The transfers were authorized by someone with the initials. The silence in the room was deafening. Norwegian Prime Minister Hansen spoke first. "Emmanuel, please tell me there's an explanation for this." Macron looked around the room desperately. He could see the trust draining from every face. You don't understand. Sometimes we must work with unsavory elements to achieve greater goods." "Greater goods?" Weber's voice was rising. "You're talking about partnership with war criminals." But Rubio wasn't finished. "The African operations were just a testing ground," he continued. "The real target was always Eastern Europe. According to this plan, France would gradually withdraw support from NATO's eastern flank, creating vulnerabilities that only Franco-Russian cooperation could address." He displayed a map marked with various colored zones. Red zones indicate areas where French intelligence has been feeding information to Russian operatives. Yellow zones show planned withdrawals of French support for local defense initiatives. Green zones represent territories where France plans to establish peacekeeping operations in partnership with Russian forces. Polish Representative Maria Kowalski, who had been silent until now, stood up abruptly. "You're telling us that France has been preparing to abandon us to Russian aggression?" "Not abandon," Rubio corrected. Trade Eastern European sovereignty for Western European hegemony under French leadership." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Representatives from Baltic states, Poland and Czech Republic were on their feet, demanding explanations. "But the most disturbing aspect," Rubio continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "is the economic warfare component." He pulled out another set of documents. Operation Financial Waterloo, a plan to crash the economies of EU member states that refused to accept French leadership. These documents detailed a sophisticated scheme involving currency manipulation, coordinated short selling of national bonds, and strategic disruption of energy supplies. The plan was to be implemented in 3 phases, Rubio explained. Phase 1, create energy crises in target countries through coordinated supply disruptions. Phase 2, use France's strategic petroleum reserves to offer rescue packages with political strings attached. Phase 3, leverage the resulting economic dependence to force political alignment. Italian Prime Minister Romano was staring at the documents in horror. Some of these target countries, Italy is on this list, as is Germany, Weber added grimly, reading over his shoulder. And Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. Essentially, Rubio summarized, every EU member state that has shown resistance to French dominance over the past 5 years. The room erupted. Accusations flew in multiple languages. Macron sat in his chair, no longer the confident leader who had opened the meeting, but a man watching his carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Spanish Prime Minister Carlos Mendez slammed his hand on the table. "Emmanuel, how could you? We trusted you. We believed in European unity." "You still don't understand," Macron finally exploded, jumping to his feet. "This was all for European unity. America has been exploiting our divisions for decades. Someone had to take charge. By betraying your allies," Weber shot back, "by conspiring with our enemies, by being realistic," Macron retorted. "You think America cares about European interests? They want us weak and divided. I was creating a strong, unified Europe under competent leadership. Whose competence? Asked Czech President Tomáš Novák. Yours? The same competence that led you to secretly fund Russian mercenaries? But Rubio had saved the most damaging revelation for last. He pulled out a slim folder marked Eyes Only. Presidential level. Mr. Macron, he said quietly, would you like to tell this room about the Normandy protocols? The blood drained from Macron's face completely. Several leaders noticed his reaction. What are the Normandy protocols? Weber demanded. Rubio opened the folder. A secret agreement signed 2 months ago between France and Russia, outlining the complete restructuring of European security architecture. According to this agreement, Russia would be granted a sphere of influence covering Eastern Europe in exchange for supporting French hegemony in Western Europe. He pulled out the document, multiple pages with official seals and signatures. The agreement includes provisions for joint French-Russian military exercises, shared intelligence operations, and coordinated economic policies designed to push American influence out of Europe entirely. This can't be real, whispered Finnish President Anna Virtanen. The agreement is countersigned by Vladimir Putin himself, Rubio continued, and by Emmanuel Macron. It's scheduled to be implemented starting next month. Macron was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. You don't understand the context, he said desperately. This was a negotiating position, not a final agreement. A negotiating position? Rubio's voice was incredulous. You agreed to recognize Russian sovereignty over Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. You agreed to withdraw French support for Baltic defense initiatives. You agreed to joint Franco-Russian naval patrols in the Baltic Sea. The representatives from Baltic states were on their feet, their faces flushed with anger and betrayal. But here's the most interesting part, Rubio continued, flipping to the final page. The agreement includes a specific timeline for engineering incidents that would justify Russian intervention in target countries. He held up a detailed schedule. Latvia, mining accident affecting Russian-speaking population, scheduled for April 15th. Estonia, cyber attack on government systems attributed to unknown Western sources, May 3rd. Lithuania, border skirmish involving Ukrainian militants, May 20. You plan false flag operations? Weber was shouting now. You plan to help Russia fabricate justifications for invasion. They weren't invasion, Macron protested. They were stabilization operations, managed interventions to prevent real conflicts. Managed by whom? Demanded Romanian President Klaus Iohannis. By you and Putin. The room was in complete chaos now. Multiple conversations were happening simultaneously in different languages. Some delegates were on their phones, others were taking frantic notes. The carefully orchestrated diplomatic atmosphere had completely collapsed. Secretary General of NATO, Admiral James Mitchell, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, please. We need to restore order and address these allegations systematically. But Rubio held up his hand. Admiral, there's one more thing. Something that affects not just European security, but global stability. He pulled out a final document, this one bearing Chinese government seals. The Franco-Russo-Chinese tripartite agreement, he announced, signed in Beijing 3 weeks ago. This document outlines the complete reshaping of the global order, with 3 spheres of influence: Chinese dominance in Asia-Pacific, Russian control of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and French leadership of Western Europe and Africa. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't just about European politics anymore, it was about the fundamental structure of international relations. According to this agreement, Rubio continued, the 3 powers would coordinate their policies to systematically undermine American influence worldwide. Joint economic initiatives, shared military technologies, coordinated diplomatic positions. He paused, looking directly at Macron. And mutual defense guarantees. If any one of the three faces American pressure, the other two pledge to respond. German Chancellor Ries stood up slowly. "Emmanuel," she said, her voice barely controlled, "tell me this isn't real. Tell me you haven't committed Europe to a military alliance with authoritarian regimes." Macron's response was barely a whisper. "You don't understand the pressures, the necessities." "I understand treason," Weber said flatly. "I understand betrayal of everything the European Union stands for." Italian Prime Minister Romano was studying the Chinese document. This agreement gives China access to European ports. Russian gas flows through European pipelines under favorable terms, and France gets what exactly? The illusion of leadership while becoming a junior partner to dictatorships. "It's not like that," Macron protested weakly. "France would maintain full sovereignty under Chinese economic oversight and Russian security guarantees." Rubio interjected. "Mr. Macron, you've essentially agreed to make Europe a protectorate." The true magnitude of the betrayal was sinking in. This wasn't just diplomatic maneuvering or power politics. It was the systematic dismantling of the post-World War II international order. Polish Representative Kowalski was reading through the documents with growing horror. According to this timeline, the transition was supposed to begin next month. The NATO summit was meant to be where you announce the European Defence Union as the first step toward withdrawing from Atlantic Partnership. "And if NATO members objected?" asked Dutch Prime Minister Vermeer. Rubio pulled out one more page. "Economic pressure, energy blackmail, and if necessary, security incidents requiring Franco-Russian intervention." The room fell silent as the full implications became clear. Macron hadn't just been planning to reshape European defense. He had been planning to effectively end European independence. Admiral Mitchell finally spoke again. "Mr. President Macron, these are allegations of unprecedented gravity. If verified, they constitute a fundamental breach of NATO principles and European Union values." Macron looked around the room one final time, seeing nothing but hostile faces and shattered trust. "You're all fools," he said quietly. "You think America will protect you forever? You think the current order is sustainable? I was offering you a future of strength, of European leadership in a multipolar world. You were offering us subjugation," Weber replied coldly, "dressed up as leadership." Marco Rubio closed his folders and looked around the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, the choice before us is clear. We can continue to build on the principles of democratic alliance and mutual respect that have kept Europe free and prosperous for 7 decades. Or we can watch as those principles are sacrificed for the illusion of power." He paused, letting his words sink in. "America has made mistakes. We've been imperfect allies at times, but we've never asked you to surrender your sovereignty to achieve strength. We've never asked you to betray your neighbors for the promise of hegemony." The silence that followed was profound. In the space of 3 minutes, 70 years of careful diplomacy had been stripped away to reveal the raw calculations of power beneath. Norwegian Prime Minister Hansen was the first to speak. "I think I speak for many of us when I say that this meeting has fundamentally changed how we view European security cooperation. The question now," added Czech President Novak, "is whether we can rebuild trust and move forward, or whether the damage is irreparable." Macron stood up slowly, his political career effectively over. "This meeting is concluded as far as France is concerned," he said with what dignity he could muster. "We will be reviewing our participation in these institutions." As he moved toward the door, Weber called out, "Manuel, don't make this worse than it already is. Work with us to find a way forward." But Macron didn't turn around. He walked out of the room, leaving behind not just a failed summit, but the wreckage of European unity as it had been known for generations. In the aftermath of his departure, the remaining leaders sat in stunned silence, contemplating the magnitude of what they had just learned. The 80 seconds of Marco Rubio's revelations had not just ended one man's political ambitions, they had potentially saved Europe from sliding into a new form of authoritarianism disguised as sovereignty. As news of the confrontation began to leak, headlines around the world would soon read, "The 3 minutes that changed everything, Macron's secret alliance exposed, and the day European unity almost died." But in that quiet meeting room in Brussels, as delegates began the long process of rebuilding trust and reimagining security cooperation, one thing was clear: sometimes the most important diplomatic victories are won not through negotiation, but through the simple act of telling the truth.